Over the decades that I've gardened, I have started thousands of plants from seed, most of them in trays like this. But I've also started seeds in big pots like this. Which is better? Join me today as I discuss trays versus pots. Hi, I'm Gardener Scott, and the answer to the question is really quite simple. Which is better, trays or big pots? The answer resoundingly is it depends. It depends on what plants you're growing. It depends on how much space you have. It depends on how much time you can devote to your seedlings. There are many factors in this decision. Most of the plants that I'm growing do best in a tray like this, but that doesn't mean that I don't also grow some of my plants from seed in bigger containers. Let's discuss some of these issues so you can make an educated decision when you're trying to decide which approach you're going to take, because there are so many options with the containers that you start your seeds in. First off, a tray like this. Now, there are 72 cells in this tray. It's designed to grow 72 distinct plants. Now, they can be all the same variety, they can be totally different. But when I use something like this, I've got 72 plants. If I put 2 seeds in each one, well, now I've got 144 plants in a relatively small space that I start my seeds in. I can go with a bigger container like this one, the Greenstock Seed Starter Kit. In roughly the same footprint, I can now grow 36 distinct plants in each of these cells. Even if I double up, I have 72, not quite as much as the smaller cells. I can start in a bigger pot in the same type of tray. A pot this size allows me to do 18 distinct plants in each of these in the same size tray. If I go up to the bigger size like this, I can only grow 8 in this same size tray. And so that's the first thing that really influences me in how I'm going to start my seeds. I grow a lot of plants, so being able to start 72 in a relatively small space gives me an advantage. In my setup behind me on these shelves, I have 3 shelves with lights. So at any given time, I can have more than 200 small seedlings that are beginning to grow in a relatively small space. If I were to start with a big pot this size or a big pot this size in the same space on these shelves, I would only be able to grow a couple dozen, maybe 30 at most. So how many plants are you growing? If it's a small number, it makes a lot of sense to go with a bigger pot. If you're growing a lot, well, it makes more sense to maybe go with the smaller cells. Now, we have to acknowledge that when we start in a small cell like this, we're going to have to up pot. We're going to have to move our plants from the small container to a bigger container at some point. Now you have to determine how big a plant do you want to transplant out into your garden. That up potting is actually going to stress the plant. It's called transplant shock. Some of the roots are going to be damaged or killed, and the plant needs some time to recover after every transplanting. Research has shown that plants that don't have that same shock, that are actually grown in a bigger container and aren't transplanted until they go outside, actually do better in the beginning. By the end of the season, it all pretty much balances out. But the plants that have less shock early in their life will give you a couple day advantage, which might be good if you live in a short growing season like mine. A big reason why the plants might do better in a bigger container has to do with the roots. If we grow in a small space, the roots are going to be confined to that small space. And eventually, as the roots grow, they're going to crowd each other out. They're going to compete for nutrients. They're going to push out the oxygen that they need. And if you keep your plants in a small container like this, they won't do as well as if you give them lots of room for the roots to spread and for the plants to grow. Now you may ask the question, but when I go to my nursery or garden center, I buy some really nice big plants that are in these little 6-packs. That's because plants grown like this in a small container are force-fed nutrients. They are doused in lots of fertilizers to get that growth. You can definitely do that in a small container like this, but the plants are going to crowd themselves out. And unless you've got a really good light setup and you understand the fertilizer needs of the plants, it's often better to just plan to up pot into a bigger pot. Now, recognizing that there's the problems with fertilizer, that also influences my decision in what plants I'm going to grow in which size container. I like filling a tray like this with a seed starter mix. Now, my seed starter mix is this. It's very simple. It's just perlite and peat moss. That's it. When I move to the active growing phase, I use a mix like this. It has compost, it has worm castings, it has some fertilizers, in addition to the perlite and the peat moss. So by starting in a nice, light, fluffy mix like the seed starter, I give my roots the best opportunity to begin growing, to fill out that space. And before they become root bound, before they start competing with each other, I'll move the plants into a bigger container, usually kind of a medium size like this, and that's when I start using the potting mix. The seed has everything it needs to support the plant. So you don't need fertilizers when you are starting your seeds. But when the seedlings are growing, you need some nutrients within the growing medium. When I start in a container like this from Greenstock or one of these bigger containers, I still want the advantage of that seed starter mix, this light, fluffy, airy container that has no nutrients. So I will blend these two methods. I'll take my container and I'll fill it with the nutrient-rich potting mix, and then I'll top it with some of the seed starter mix. Now when I start my seeds, and most seeds are started relatively shallow, the medium is not interfering with the growth of those roots. But as those roots begin to grow down, now they can begin feeding on the potting mix below. So recognize that the differences in the medium and the difference in the seed or seedlings needs may influence not only the size of your container, but how you fill your containers. A simple mix like this with just the perlite and the peat moss is relatively inexpensive. And so if I don't have the germination, I've really lost close to nothing. The only plants that I'm up potting are the ones that are doing well. If I start in a container that has a more expensive potting mix and they don't do well, well, I'm essentially wasting the expense of this potting mix. The anticipation that there might be problems with germination is a big reason why I use a tray like this, particularly for newer gardeners that are starting out and are concerned about whether their plants are going to grow. You can make more mistakes in the small cells like this. And so at the end of this seed starting season, when I'm actually putting the plants outside, the ones that are going outside are going to be the strongest. At any point in the process, I can thin out the plants. I don't have to grow everything. If essentially I've put all of my seeds into the same pots and I don't have the success, well, now I don't have as many plants, and maybe not as many strong plants going out into my garden. So using that method of a lot of plants and then narrowing it down to the strongest plants works better for me than just hoping that the small number of plants that I start are going to end up being good ones that I can put out in my garden. And so it may sound like I'm a big advocate of growing in a 72 cell tray like this. And I am. I like these. That's why I've grown thousands of plants in these trays. So why would I use these pots to grow? Well, one of the biggest advantages to a pot like this is that all of this potting mix in this container will stay damp, support the plant, and allow you less effort. You don't need to water these big containers as often. A small cell like this probably needs watering every single day. So if I know that there's going to be gaps in my ability to take care of my seeds or my seedlings, I often start with a bigger container like this. If I know that I have some travel plans coming up or other events that are going to interfere with my seed growing, I start in something like this. I can have all of this moist soil mix in a container like this with a seedling or the seeds waiting to germinate, and on Friday I leave and I go do whatever it is I'm going to do for the weekend. When I come back on Monday, I can expect that the soil that's in a bigger container like this is still going to be moist. That's the advantage of using peat moss or cocoa coir in a potting mix like this. It retains the water. But in a cell like this, if I leave on Friday and don't come back till Monday, I might have killed all my seedlings. It might have dried out. And I have done that before. So anticipating what your season is going to look like during the seed starting phase can make a difference. I have other lights. I have other tables. I can start some of my seeds in containers like this and essentially just walk away and not worry too much about it. The amount of time that the plant is going to take before I put it outside is also a big consideration in the size of the container that I use to start my seeds. Now, most of the plants that I'm growing in these 72 cell trays are tomatoes and peppers and eggplants and perennial flowers. Those are plants that take weeks, sometimes months from the time that I start the seed until I put the plant outside. So I have plenty of time to take care of the seedlings, to up pot, and then reach a size that I'm looking for transplanting. But if I want to start something like a squash or a melon or lettuce or spinach, something that grows much faster, well then it doesn't make as much sense to start small and up pot, because 3 weeks after you start the seed, you might be putting that plant outside. That's when you start reaching for a bigger container, maybe a medium-sized container, to start those type of plants. The plants that are only going to be indoors under lights for maybe 3 or 4 weeks. There's not going to be an up potting point. You're going to start the seed, grow the plant, and then take this container outside for transplanting into your garden beds. That's what I'm going to be doing with these green stock seed starters. I'm going to start the seeds in these containers a few weeks before I plan to transplant them into the green stock. I'm going to do the mix of the potting soil and the seed starter in each of these cells, and there will be no up potting. I'll be growing my herbs and my lettuces, all those wonderful things I like to grow in a green stock, in these containers, and just do one transplanting from this out into the green stock when it's time. Find what works best for you. You can modify it over the years. That's why I have so many different size pots and I follow different methods, because each plant has a preference, just like you as a gardener have your preference. figure that out, and the question of which is better may have a more definitive answer. If you want to see more information about how I start my seeds and how I make my seed starter mixes, go ahead and watch one of these videos next. I'm Gardener Scott. Enjoy gardening.